Today we stand in Pirrus field, where the Red Harvest War did not end with victory. It ended with agreement, ink pressed into paper, while the ground was still warm from burning. This tale is about the moment when the magic stepped back from the common hand and learned to accept its limits.
Doqora Jen kept her boots in the same shallow groove of mud as the men beside her, because if she adjusted her footing, she would feel the tremor that ran through the ground, and she would be tempted to react to it. The field had a name that had once meant hedges, boundary stones, and the turn of the seasons. Now, Pirrus field meant ash in the furrows, broken spear shafts, and warped arrowheads. She held Vern, her wand, close and readied, its bone pale enough to pick up the dull light and give it back. It was translucent in places where the carving had thinned it, so that the internal struts showed like the ribs of a small fish. A spiral channel ran along it, and in the deepest turns, small stones sat half swallowed by the bone, blue-grey and green in colour. General Johns was ahead of them, and he did not look like a man who expected to live. His sword was still sheathed. Drawing it too early invited death. His men held pikes and shields, their hands raw where the leather straps bit, their breath visible in the air. The retreat had been ordered, but every step backwards had to be purchased in blood. Doqora watched the far side of the field, and saw shapes moving there, powerful wielders of magic among the milling infantry. The soldiers called them all mages, with no distinction between schools. Doqora knew better, of course, and could sense the differences. Some presences were hot and aggressive, some cold and probing, and others restrained and curative. She heard John speak. "Jen." "I'm here, General." "You see him?" "I see the edge of him." "Don't let him make you show what you are." Doqora shook her head. "If he comes across, I will have to." "Not unless I say," Johns replied, and she felt anger over the necessity of this arrangement. She had chosen this side and not the Red Harvest faction, because she had seen power used on common, innocent folk. She had chosen it because she had seen a child drop screaming as someone had reached into the inside of his skull and turned a thought like a key. She had chosen it because she had promised herself she would not become that. Still, being a weapon under orders was a bitterness that never quite felt right to her. A rumbling sound vibrated across the field, and the men braced, their grips tightening on pike shafts and their shields raising. A few began to make the sign that was supposed to ward off fire. Doqora did not rebuke them. People needed rituals when they had no control. The haze parted enough for her to see a figure at its centre. Icharad Furent did not stride like a hero. He was confident enough that the world would make way for him. He held Shivering Vale more like a staff. The wand was substantial and weighty, darker than hers, the bone fire-hardened to an amber soot tone with dark red veining through it. Raised bands gave the hand purchase, and carvings cut deep into the surface. Metal bit into the bone, reinforcement masquerading as ornament, and small firestones sat in recessed sockets along its spine. Johns raised his left hand. It was a small gesture, but his men had learned to obey his silent directions. "Hold," he said. "Shields up." Doqora heard the scrape of wood and leather as the order was obeyed. Across the churned ground, Icharad paused and spoke, and though the words were not shouted, they carried. "You've held for too long, General." Johns did not answer or look toward him. He kept his eyes fixed on the near ground, where a man could still be killed by a blade. Icharad's eyes moved past John's, and Doqora felt his scrutiny land on her. He smiled. "Hydron," he said. Doqora did not raise Ryavern. She kept it where it was, and she waited. The worst thing you could do with a Pirrus was show fear. Fear gave them permission. Icharad lifted Shivering. The firestones along it brightened with a deepening glow, and the men began to sweat in the cold. Doqora heard John speak again, still without looking back. "Jen." "I see. Not yet," he said. A sound like a sigh ran through the line. A few ordinary soldiers moved forward, shields raised, like this were a normal battle, and steel and courage could settle it. Doqora pitied them, for they had been dragged into a war that began as a quarrel among the gifted. They were fodder for dreams of dominion. Icharad's wand tipped slightly, and heat gathered in the air above the pikes, visible as wavering distortion, until the front edge of the mortal line began to smoke. Not the men quite yet, just the wood, the pitch, and the oiled leather. Doqora felt the temptation to answer in kind, and throw up a wall of water to quench everything, but that would show too much. It would make her the spectacle, and probably the invitation for escalation. John's did not give her that. He took one step forward, sword still sheathed, and raised his voice just enough to be heard. "Hold," he said again. "You lot, hold." A man near Doqora whimpered at the smell. The smoke carried memories of villages that burned with people inside their homes, because someone wanted to prove a point. Doqora leaned close to John's shoulder. "If he keeps this up, they'll break." "They won't," John said, and there was no pride in it, only certainty bought from too many dead. Across the field, Icharad had expected the line to collapse. That had been the pattern early in the war, a show of power, a demonstration. Then the mortal will broke like brittle wood. It did not break now. The men held. Their shields smoked, and their arms trembled, but their pikes stayed level. Icharad's wand lifted higher, and John's hand tightened into a fist, then opened. A command to brace. Men dug in their feet, and the line sank as one, taking its weight into the ground. That was when Doqora felt the river. It was not visible from where they stood. It ran behind them, a broad, shallow flow that cut the field's edge and fed the marsh beyond. In the old days, it had been a convenience for travellers. In this war, it had been something of a boundary. The air now burned with heat. The front rank's shields began to flare at the edges. One man yelped as his strap burned his wrist. Another shook his shield without thinking, and John's barked a single command that snapped him back into the line. Doqora could take this away. She could. She could draw water up through the soil, through the buried channels, through the veins of the field itself, and she could smother the burn in an instant. She could raise a sheet of spray that would turn to steam and blind the aggressors. She could do worse if she let herself. But she did not have permission, and instead stared at John's back until her muscles began to knot. It would take only a nod, only the smallest allowance. John's did not give it. Icharad's fire gathered, and in that moment Doqora understood, with the greatest of clarity, that John's was not merely commanding soldiers, he was commanding her restraint. Restraint was the only argument the mortals could make that might be heard by those with magical powers. If she answered with spectacle, the war would never end. It would only become a contest of who could burn the most, drown the most, break the most, and the mortals would be trampled between the extremes. Still, the line was beginning to waver. One man began to sob, the sound raw and childlike. Another clenched his teeth so hard the blood ran from his gums. Doqora leaned closer. "Johns, if you don't let me..." He spoke quietly, but the words cut. "If you do it now, Jen, he will do it bigger." As if to prove him right, Icharad's wand trembled slightly, and she felt a surge of heat that was not aimed at the shields, but at the ground beneath the line, the hidden tinder of old roots, dried thatch, and buried straw. He was preparing to make the field itself burn under their feet. Ryavern's stones darkened, and cool spread into her palm and through her body. Johns's hand lifted at last, in a tired, small concession. "Now," he said. Doqora stepped out of the line just enough to be seen, and she raised her wand. She did not call a wave or summon a flood. She reached for the river with the careful precision of a surgeon reaching for a vein. The field reacted, and water was suddenly everywhere. It rose through the soil in thin threads, wicking into the dry roots and old straw. A mist lifted from the ground in front of the shields, with just enough moisture in it to take the edge off the fire. The smoking shields hissed, and the straps cooled. Across the field, the fire stuttered. Icharad's smile returned, but it had changed. It was no longer the smile of someone demonstrating. It was the smile of someone recognizing and welcoming a threat. Doqora kept her attention on the line, on the men's hands and the tremor in their arms. If she looked at him, it would become personal. If it became personal, it would be a duel, and duels were what the Red Harvest faction lived for. They turned war into theatre and called it destiny. Doqora held the moisture in the ground and felt the strain of sustained restraint. She had always been told that water was yielding, adaptive, and patient. They did not speak enough about what patience cost. Icharad lifted Shivering again, and this time he did not aim at shields. He aimed at the air above the line, pulling heat together until it became a pressure that pushed down on them. Men began to cough, and their eyes watered. They were suffocating. Doqora felt it immediately and responded without thinking. Suffocation was a kind of drowning, and she knew drowning. She drew the mist up and spread it to cool the air and give burning lungs something to cling to. Steam rose between the lines, and for a moment Pirrus Field looked like a fog-bound plateau. Icharad was angry now, and Shivering stones flared brighter. He was going to escalate, and Doqora knew it. She felt it. But then another presence pressed into the field. It did not come from Johns's line. It came from behind, a living growth, a verdicrant's presence, green and thorned, intent on only the arrangement of power around Icharad. Doqora recognized what was happening. The war had been full of this, though the mortals seldom saw it clearly. The enemy coalition was not a single beast. It was a pack of predators that frequently turned on each other. Icharad's attention broke away from the mortal line as a voice carried across the field. "Enough, Furent." Doqora could not see the speaker clearly through the steam and ash, but she felt the verdicrant's presence well enough. It was not aimed at her, it was aimed at their own side, at this Pirrus whose arrogance had begun to outweigh his usefulness. Icharad did not sheath Shivering. There would be no show of weakness from him, and he held it steady. The voice came again. "Izora is dead." The words landed heavily. Even among the mortals, few could have spoken it aloud. Izora Nick Foyle had been the spearhead of the Red Harvest faction, the one who had convinced enough schools and enough beings that mortals could be made into an obedient foundation for a new order in the Marchlands. Doqora had never seen her, only what followed in her wake. Icharad's expression did not change. "No," he said, and for the first time his voice had some doubt. "She cannot be." "She is," the voice replied, "and if you keep burning mortals in front of everyone, you will be next." Icharad stood very still, and the wan stones dimmed. The air cooled enough that men stopped coughing and began to breathe again. Doqora did not relax, though. She knew what it meant when one as powerful as he became still. It was a decision point. Icharad spoke, but not to the mortals. "Who says this?" Her figure moved forward through the haze, and for a moment Doqora saw a woman's outline, hair bound back, a cloak that looked as if it had once been green and was now stained to something dirtier. When she stepped into clearer light, Doqora saw the way the ground seemed to respond to her, with roots tightening and grasses that should have been dead lifting slightly. This was Sanmadra Brill. Doqora had heard the name in the camps, spoken with a mixture of dread and contempt, a verdicrance from the enemy side, powerful enough to be courted and clever enough to survive. Someone who had not always favoured Izora's vision, but who had been willing to ride it while it promised her an advantage. Sanmadra's eyes did not rest upon John's or the mortals. They went to Icharad. "Olrubin calls a council," she said. "You will attend." "Olrubin," he repeated, and it was clear he did not like the name. Doqora did not know Olrubin personally, but she knew he was the High Mage and represented an authority made out of shared fear of what happened when no one restrained the gifted. Heat flared along the bone shaft of Kiravel. "And if I refuse?" "Then you will face the mortals here," Sanmadra said, "and you will face those of us behind you." Her eyes then moved briefly to the thin mist held by Doqora. "And you will face those who have learned to answer, even with restraint." Doqora felt the chill of being acknowledged as a consideration in a power balance. She did not like it, but this was how peace was being made, with arithmetic. Icharad stared at Sanmadra, but slowly he lowered his wand. Johns did not waste the moment. "Back," he said, his voice controlled. "Back now. Keep your line. No one breaks." His men began to withdraw in disciplined steps, pikes still level, shields still up. Doqora moved with them, keeping the mist low and thin, easing it away as they fell back toward the river. When they reached the river's edge, Johns finally turned to face her properly. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes red from smoke and fatigue. "You did well," he said. "They're breaking apart," Doqora observed. "They always were," Johns replied. He looked back toward Pirwotton Field. "Now they've run out of reasons to pretend otherwise." Doqora stared at the river, at the dull surface carrying ash downstream. "And if they regroup?" "Then we stand again," Johns said. He paused, then added, "But Olrubin won't let it go that far, I hope." "You trust him?" Johns thought a moment. "I don't trust any of you," he said. "That's why I want it written by those you respect." The council was convened in the aftermath, but there was no grandeur or carved hall waiting for history. They met beneath a roof assembled from salvaged timbers and torn canvas. Doqora stood close to Johns, while Icharad Furent stood on the opposite side of the space, with Shivering held at his side. The bone looked darker in this light. The red veining faded. The firestones were dim, but not dead. When Doqora looked at him, she saw a man unwillingly constrained and not yet defeated. It was an important distinction, because defeated men broke, while constrained men waited. Sanmadra Brill stood slightly forward of him, waiting for Olrubin's arrival. When he came, there was no fanfare or announcement. People simply fell quiet. Doqora did not know which school he claimed. The way he moved suggested he had learned to make his authority visible without wasting energy. His eyes took in the space calmly. Johns stepped forward first. "High Mage," he said. He did not bow or kneel. He held himself as a man who had bled for the right to stand. "General Johns," he replied, and Doqora felt that Olrubin had taken the trouble to learn the mortal's name and use it as equal currency. That alone was notable. Sanmadra spoke next. "Izora Nickfoyle is dead," she said again, and the words were not a threat now. They were a fact laid on the table like a severed head. "Her deputy holds no mandate, and I stand for what remains." Icharad silently abhorred the phrasing, but he did not contradict her. His quiet was its own admission that the Red Harvest's unity had been a performance. Olrubin nodded. "Then we speak terms," he said. Doqora waited for someone to begin with speeches, with the old language of honour and destiny that the gifted used to dress their cruelty. It did not come. Johns took a folded sheet from a leather tube at his side and held it out. "Plain," he said, "written, copied, sent." Sanmadra looked at the paper. "Mortals want to legislate for magic." John's voice stayed calm. "Mortals want to survive it. We do not deny it." This was the truth Doqora had always known as she witnessed villages burned for discipline, wells boiled for leverage, and mines bent because someone wanted obedience. Olrubin did not rebuke Sanmadra or flatter Johns. He simply reached out and took the paper. His fingers were bare, no rings or markings, nothing that signalled a school. Doqora understood that it was deliberate. The High Mage was refusing to be claimed. He read. The lantern light moved over his face, catching the lines under his eyes. When he finished, he looked up. "This is acceptable," he said, and the tension released a little. Sanmadra snapped back. "Acceptable to whom?" "To the marchlands," Olrubin replied. "To those who are left." Icharad then spoke up. "You would bind us," he said. "You would forbid us to act." "You acted," John said quietly, and the simplicity of it was like a blow. "Look outside." Icharad looked toward the canvas, and the dark beyond where Pirrus Field lay scarred, and his body seemed to slump. The fire in him wanted argument, but the exhaustion in him could not summon the strength. Olrubin's voice gained authority. "The terms are these," he said, and then he did what Johns had demanded. He spoke plainly. Doqora listened as the boundaries were set in words that could be copied without distortion. Users of magic would not directly compel, alter, or destroy common mortals except in immediate defense of life. No enchantment would be used upon crops, weather, fertility, bloodlines, or water to control communities or extract compliance. No binding of mortal bodies or minds. No marks that could be used to claim ownership. No breeding or remaking. Those who studied would do so under law, not whim. Those who broke these terms would be treated as criminals under an agreement recognised by all parties present, mortal and magical alike. It was not a promise of peace. It was a structure for stability, a line drawn in the ash of the Red Harvest War. San Madra's face did not soften, but something in her recognised the inevitability of consequence. "And who enforces it?" she asked. "All of us," Olrubin said. "That is the point. No more private wars disguised as destiny." Johns stepped forward again. "It will be published," he said, "in every hamlet, village, town and city that still has a wall or a post, copied by hand until there are no hands left. The people will know what is permitted and what is not." San Madra looked at him with something close to disgust. "You think knowledge protects them?" "Knowledge warns them," John said, "and warning gives a man time to raise a pike." Doqora felt a grim approval at that, because she wanted magic to remember that mortals were not clay. Olrubin extended the paper towards San Madra. "Accept verdicrants," he said. San Madra took it. For a moment she held it without looking at it, weighing the insult of the ink against the reality of extinction. Then she bent her head and signed. She did not tremble, and she did not apologize. Olrubin turned to Johns. "Sign," he said. Johns signed with a hand that had held a sword more than a quill. His letters were blunt, but they were legible, and he handed the paper back. Icharad, as Izora's deputy, was next. Doqora watched his face as he took the paper. For the first time since she had seen him on Pirwotton Field, she saw something like loss in his eyes. It was the grief of someone realizing a door has been closed and would not open again, no matter how loudly he pounded it. He looked at the terms, and then, with visible restraint, he signed and handed it back. Olrubin folded the paper and returned it to Johns. "Copy it," he said. "Send it." Johns nodded. "By dawn," he replied. The council began to break apart as fatigue took over. People moved through the smoke with difficulty, the distant sound of men digging graves a reminder of what had ended. Doqora remained where she was for a moment, her wand cool in her hand. She watched Icharad Furent as he turned to leave. He did not look at her, offer threat, or give any acknowledgement. He just walked away, knowing he must never open the door again. San Madra Brill paused at the canvas edge, her silhouette briefly framed against the dark. She glanced back at them. "Stability," she murmured, "until someone decides the law is worth breaking." Olrubin's voice answered from behind her, calm and cold. "Then we remind them why it was written." Doqora stepped closer to Johns as he tucked the folded paper away. "Will it hold?" she asked. Johns looked out into the night. "It'll hold until it doesn't," he said. "But when it doesn't, people will know what to call it. They'll know it's not a miracle or a curse. They'll know it's a crime." Doqora nodded and turned Ryavern in her hand, watching the small stones embedded in the translucent bone under the light. They looked like river pebbles trapped under ice. She thought of water, patient and restrained, and of how patience could be a kind of violence when it was forced. Behind her the quills began to scratch as the first copies were made, ink pressed into paper with tired hands. Outside, Pirwotton Field lay silent, and the Red Harvest War began its journey into history.
The lesson of Pirrus is a simple one. Power does not become dangerous when it is hated, but when it is unquestioned. In the end, it was not fire or water that decided the Red Harvest War. It was the refusal of ordinary people to vanish quietly, and the knowledge that any power which must rule by fear has already begun to fail.